So what would you make of this particular move? Is there something to celebrate about?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anangwe, for inviting us and, of course, sharing this topic. Yesterday, on 29th, Transparency International, a global movement, launched all over the world the known as Corruption Perception Index.
Yeah.
And, of course, as you mentioned, African countries are scored very, very below, and among the top least corrupted include Rwanda with 56 out of 100. This does not mean that Rwanda is a clean, free corruption country, but Rwanda is positioned among the few countries ranked ahead of at least 50%. At the global level, the average scoring is 43, which means that corruption is really everywhere and endemic in many, many countries all over the world. So without celebrating, I think Rwanda can be proud of the progress is making in this struggle, which is really which is challenging for many other countries.
Now, still looking at this particular score that we've seen, 1 point improvement. Of course, someone somewhere would be saying, yes, we've done well, but of course, we're looking at the efforts that were put, coming from the top citizen of this particular country, that is the president of this country, with his goodwill when it comes to the fight against corruption, improving only 1 point. How do you explain this to people who are strong, people who are proponents of corruption, who are hating corruption in this sense?
Yeah, this index is perception-based scoring, and as you know, the perception takes time to change the behavior, and it's of course it's based on aggregated data from other sources of data. From one former lead expert in developing CPI called GRAFT, he says that an improvement of 1% is equal to about 1.5% of increase of direct investments. And it's also equal to an increase of 4% of income for household. So meaning that the 1% that we see for Rwanda as an improvement, it means a lot in terms of trust, an increase of trust, and of course in terms of economic progress. So, but looking to what the country is doing, really, of course, I agree with you. It's not at the level of the effort made in the country.
When you compare this result. Now, let's talk about this dragon, that is corruption, that every country has been struggling to slay. In Kenya, for instance, the government there has, increased its momentum in the fight against graft, but it's still dropped as well. But let's talk about one of the things that is very key here, because some people have challenged Transparency International, some saying double standards is usually involved in here, and others have just said your work is just to issue these reports. But how do these reports work towards the elimination or the fight against graft? How would you respond to people who criticize you in this sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. This report, it's a barometer, again, on the national efforts done in the fight against corruption, because it's based on as I said, it's aggregate data from other sources of surveys, and it's based on experts who witness progress done by various countries. So I think this report in itself is not enough. It has to be complemented by other surveys. As you are aware, Transparency International Rwanda undertakes at national level what is known as the Rwanda Bribery Index. What is very interesting is to see the last report we published, majority of Rwandans said corruption is keeping decreasing, which is coming to really to ascertain the findings of Corruption Perception Index as published by.
So moving forward then, when you're looking at this index that keeps coming, I think every year we've been seeing it coming in on and off. How do we then consolidate the gains as a country, as far as a country that is known as zero tolerance to corruption in that particular matter? How does Rwanda ensure that it consolidates the gains in this line?
I think from each report, the various stakeholders, especially at national level, gain some lessons. For example, the recent reforms which were introduced, for example, in terms of the law punishing corruption, now it has been really tightened in terms of making very costly the corruption practices in Rwanda. It's, for example, now in Rwanda, corruption is no longer a prescriptable crime. So as long as you have misused public funds, as long as you are prosecuted for corruption, you will end by facing the courts. So and every time when there is such report, there is time to reflect on what is going well, and of course address or find strategies to close the loopholes. And this is probably the best lessons, best practices in Rwanda, which is combined, of course, as you mentioned, by the high level political will. I personally am witnessing here at national level how all stakeholders are engaged, are involved in the fight against corruption. It's really the real struggle.
Right, but this doesn't mean that there is no corruption in Rwanda, because we've seen, you've been able to mention the figures, which I mentioned earlier on, but also you've pointed fingers at several institutions. The judiciary, there have been some corruption cases in there, land, transfer documents. So then how do we roll back these numbers of corruption cases in that sense, just very briefly?
Yes, when we release our report, we really show where there are loopholes for corruption. Especially, we have been able to see that where there is high level of interactions, when citizens seek a service, there is risks of corruption. We mentioned, for example, in permit licensing in construction or unlawful constructions, or sometimes the traffic police pointed out as vulnerable to corruption and so forth. When such figures come out, concerned policymakers approaches Transparency International Rwanda to discuss and to see how jointly we can put in place strategies. And among others, there are, for example, service charters which are developed jointly, outreach campaign to mobilize citizens to report. So yes, from the cases we collect, we receive on corruption at the national level, they are used to improve the systems related to the prevention and fighting corruption.
Right, so if Rwanda was a student that you're sponsoring in school and brought you this report card, would you be able to say, very good, well done, or what would you be reporting back?
On a good track, on a good track.
On good track.
Yes.
You would write CB.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Mr.